Hey y'all, Data Guy here, and today I am taking it back to my roots and coming at you with a reverse ETL pipeline that I'm going to show you how to build from Salesforce into Snowflake. Very common need for most people to bring data out of Salesforce and store it in Snowflake, so it can be collated, processed, added to a historical database, joined with other information, and also just more easily queryable in Snowflake versus Salesforce. So that's what I'm going to show you how to build today, and the engine for doing that is going to be Airflow. So I'm going to show you how we can do kind of a reverse ETL pipeline where we're going to start by extracting Salesforce data into an S3 bucket, loading it into a staging area, and then into Snowflake. And then we're actually going to sync it with HighTouch, which is another kind of customer management platform so that you can see how you can bring data from one application to another using Snowflake as your middle ground between those two applications and kind of a staging area for that. So really, really cool. And then actually bring that transform data back into Salesforce. So really just kind of a full kind of encapsulation of the entire, whether you want to bring data out of Snowflake into Snowflake from an application or transfer data between applications. This guideline and this kind of DAG will give you an example on how to do all of that. So without further ado, let's set up our environment and start building. So the first thing we're going to do is just create a clean Airflow environment. So go to desktop, get repos, make directory, reverse ETL SF, and then CD into that. Reverse. Awesome. Then within this Ansible directory, we're just going to run astro dev init. This is just going to generate all the different folders and files we need to start up a local Airflow environment. And then go to my desktop and actually find it. So here we go, take our repos, reverse ETL, awesome. So now I have Airflow environment all set up, ready to go. And the first thing I'll need to do is actually add some requirements and packages. So just a few requirements we'll need for this. So here, Amazon provider for using S3 bucket as kind of an intermediate data storage, HTTP provider for making API requests, Salesforce for accessing Salesforce, querying it, getting data out of there, Snowflake for obviously using Snowflake, and then HighTouch as well for syncing our data at the end. And so here, actually I'm going to delete all these versions because they're very old versions. And then once we're done deleting the version pins, just save the file, and we're off to the races. So now we can go open up our DAGs folder and create a new DAG called reverse ETL salesforce.py. Now we can start building our DAG. So the first thing we're going to do, as we do with all of our DAGs, is start importing all of our packages and requirements. So here, what we're going to do is bring in datetime for obviously using datetime. I bring in pretty much all my DAGs just for that datetime object. Also bringing in the HighTouch trigger sync operator for doing that HighTouch sync at the end, syncing our Salesforce data with other data within our platform. Also bringing in the Airflow DAGs object, the chain objects, we can chain tasks together, the dummy operator, just so we can have empty dummy tasks, and then also the S3 copy object operator, the S3 delete objects operator for interacting with S3 along with the Salesforce to S3 operator. Also bringing in a Snowflake operator for obviously connecting and interacting with Snowflake. And then again, the S3 to Snowflake operator for bringing data from our intermediary S3 storage bucket into Snowflake. And then finally, also importing the Airflow trigger rules so we can define more complex trigger rules within our DAG. So things like, hey, if only one succeeds, if all succeed, that's what trigger rules are for, that more advanced inter-task logic. So then once we're done importing all of our different tasks and DAGs, we're also going to need to import but set some important environment variables. So here our first one is going to be a data lake landing bucket. So if you haven't stored this in your Airflow environment, just set this here. But he also always recommends setting these variables just as Airflow variables or environment variables. Then we also have the data lake raw bucket. So the raw bucket, that's just going to take the raw data. And then our landing bucket is for the transform data after we sync it. So we have a record of that transform data. We also have a date folder path, so we can have different folders for each date, so our data gets segmented by date, so it's more easily searchable down the line. Also, we'll have the Salesforce S3 base path, so just the base path for all of our Salesforce information. So we're going to build this in combination with our date folder path, our Salesforce file name, so this is going to take the current date, build a file name, and then we'll use this as the key for storing our data within S3. And then AWS connection ID, so just whatever you've called your AWS connection ID, in this case S3, and as well your Snowflake connection ID, which is just going to refer to as Snowflake. Then we've got all of our things set up for starting to build a DAG. So then what we can do is define our DAG object here. So here what we're going to do is with DAG, modern ETL with reverse ETL, set a start date. None of these are really important, but only thing here is that we're actually going to include some SQL statements within our include directory. I'll show you how to set that up in a second. So just so you have this template search path so it knows that when I'm pulling from a directory, I'm pulling from that include SQL directory. Then the next step we're going to need to do is defining our beginning and ending operators. So these are just going to be dummy operators that I'm just going to use for setting beginning and ending start and stop, just so it doesn't start with an upload process. And then our first actual task is going to be uploading our Salesforce data into an S3 landing page. So here we have is upload Salesforce data to S3. So bringing the Salesforce data out of Salesforce into our S3 bucket. And here we have our task ID, Salesforce query, S3 bucket name, data, and this is just pulling the variables we already said earlier. So that landing bucket, then building that key based on the base path and file name, which has that date, time in it. Using our Salesforce connection ID, so this is assuming you set your default Salesforce connection just as Salesforce, and then also the AWS connection ID we set earlier. So now, how do we set up these SQL scripts that we can actually use those? So here we'll go into the include directory, and we're going to create a new file called SQL, and then we're going to save some files inside of this. And then within SQL, we're actually going to create another folder that's going to be called Salesforce for our Salesforce script. Save them both in the SQL folder. I just chose to do this for kind of additional brevity, and it's really best practices to have your SQL statements organized and saved alongside your Airflow environment rather than hard coding them within the DAGs, because it makes it much easier to reuse those SQL statements and avoids you needing to kind of keep rewriting them. So then within this Salesforce folder, we're going to write extract _accounts.sql. And this will be our SQL statements going to extract the data from our Salesforce that we actually need. So here, keeping it very simple, all we want to do is just get the ID and name from each account within Salesforce. Obviously, customize this to your own desires. And then also, while we're here in the include directory, we're also going to create another folder called Snowflake. And within here, we're going to add first a new folder for just common utilities. So these are things that you would be using across different DAGs and tasks. So call this common. And then within this, create a new file called truncate_table.sql. And then within here, we're going to bring in some very simple SQL code here, just truncating our table. And these will all make sense when I'm kind of going through with the DAG, but just doing a lot of setup right now. This is just truncating a table that we're going to upload to make it a little bit smaller. We're also going to add a reporting folder. So folder, reporting. And then within this folder, we're going to create a new file called build registry reporting.sql. And then we are going to write a very, very complex SQL statement here for actually building an analytics report. So this is, a more complex SQL statements like, hey, I now want to take all this raw data, build it into a really clean report. So not going to go through every line here, but it's just partitioning by various relevant variables, extracting it all, doing some sums to do some summary on total visitors, total page visits, rather than just going line by line for every single customer and their page visits. Just looking at more of a macro level by month, by quarter, by week, to get those overall view of traffic. Now the last folder we're going to need to create, last SQL statement, is going to be staging. Folder, and then we're going to just create a load customers staging SQL file. So load _customers staging.sql. And here what we're going to do is just basically load in our raw data from our staging table into an actual customer database table. So just bring it from an intermediary staging area into our long-term storage. And these are all the SQL statements you'll need for this DAG. And then we can go back to our DAG and keep working on this piece of the action. Now, the next thing we're going to do is truncate our table for customers within Snowflake. So this is using that truncate SQL statement we just did, which is going to be just basically eliminating all the unnecessary data from our staging table for customers prior to loading. So removing all of the past runs from this table so that we have a fresh table for our new data that we're uploading, rather than keeping the old data and then have it dealing with duplicates down the line. So you could either have it done this way where each new load before it starts loading, it cleans out all the data in that staging table, or you could have something like this at the end of every load after that data is loaded into its long-term storage table, clearing out the staging areas used. But however you want to do it, just want to show an example of it. Next, after we're done with truncate table, so we have a clean landing area within Snowflake for our data. We're then going to copy our data from S3 into Snowflake. So using that S3 to Snowflake operator, using copy from S3 to Snowflake. Then we have our set staging area. So it's the table within Snowflake that you're using for staging. Prefix here, this is so it knows where in your S3 bucket to actually pull data from. The file format, so make sure you're using, you can define however your data looks and is defined. Make sure this file format aligns with that. File formats are really important to get right with Snowflake. If you don't have the right file format, it's going to struggle to load the data. So look at your data, look at the definition for the default Snowflake file formats, but then also you have the option to create your own. So whatever you use, have that here as your file format within Snowflake. And then obviously your Snowflake connection ID and the table that is being used. And then the next step from that is, so we brought our data into that staging table. Now we're actually going to bring that into our dimensional customer table, so our actual staging area. So here we're loading that customer staging, so loading that data from our customer's staging environment into our long-term customers database. So you can see here selecting all the names, current timestamp, that any active customers, we're going to remove any not provided names. We don't want any dummy data, trying to make sure our data that we're ingesting is clean. And so making sure also for no duplicates as well. Then once we're done with that, so we've loaded our Snowflake data into our long-term customers database, we're then going to use that to rebuild our customer website reporting table. So this is bringing that data into Snowflake and then running this really complex SQL statement that's going to take all of that SQL or all of that customer data and then update dashboard with the most recent additions. So rerun all these calculations to make use of the most recent data, and then use that to update the reporting dashboard that your business would depend on. So that's building that in there. And then what we're also going to do is move our landed accounts data file from that S3 file into a long-term data lake. So we're actually also going to save our S3 data to a data lake as well. So we have the option to have that raw data available for if we want to process it in a different way, if we want to just look at, hey, what does this raw data look like before it's processed? A lot of times having that in data lake storage, you don't, if you're using a data lake, you're not doing your analysis up front. So I just kind of want to show you, hey, if you're using traditional data warehouse, you probably don't need to do this. But if you are using a kind of data lake strategy, you want to have that raw data available for other use cases. Highly recommend storing it in kind of a more long-term data lake format in its untransformed state. Then what we're going to do is after we've taken that data and persisted it to our data lake storage location, we're then going to delete that data from our S3 landing buckets. We have a clean S3 landing bucket to use for our next piece of data uploads. We don't have to worry about things being overwritten or duplicate data. And then finally, we're going to sync all of this customer data with its website traffic metrics back into Salesforce. So here we're using the high touch trigger sync operator, and this will require you obviously use high touch to sync all of our data that we just uploaded from this cut into the customers table. Now within that customers table, it's being added to all the website traffic. Imagine any other data around that customer outside of what was collected just in Salesforce. Now we can merge any new customers with data we've collected from other platforms and then update their Salesforce profile with all of that new relevant information, so we still can use Salesforce as a single record of truth. So really important step here if you want to make sure that you have a clean, up-to-date Salesforce with all relevant information then. But if you don't care about having Salesforce have all the most relevant information, don't bother. And those are all the tasks we need to define. So the last step is just setting our task dependencies. So here we have a few different uses of the chain operator. So begin, uploads, data to S3, pretty much just running this linearly, but also in parallel to our main kind of data processing pipeline, we're actually also in parallel doing the persistent data lake storage. We're deleting that data from S3 after it's done. So we have kind of different branches for our different operations that we're doing. So we're not doing everything linearly. And that's the full DAG written out. So now let's go into the Airflow UI, add some connections, and you'll see what this DAG looks like running. So now here within the Airflow UI, you'll need to define 3 connections. So your Amazon connection, AWS, Amazon Web Services here. You'll also need your Snowflake connection and your high touch connection. Not going to bother going through how to set up all those connections. Very easily documentatable, and I don't want to show my sensitive data. But assuming you've gotten all your connections right, your ending DAG will look something like this. So you can see relatively linear, but with some parallelism so we can load and do some of that storing, data cleanup in sync in parallel, so we can make use of all those slots on those Airflow worker nodes and not do things sequentially, because that's not the Airflow way. It's all about parallelism. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you got some value out of it, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Data Guy out.